Hello, this is DrGAKMAN here selling some more Nintendo related items on eBay. I need the money, obviously, because I'm selling some classic stuff here. These are old Game Boy games. There are also Game Boy Color, and some of which are also Game Boy, Super Game Boy games. If you don't know what a Super Game Boy game is, the NES had the Super NES had this attachment called the Super Game Boy. This is not included in this collection, I'm sorry, but I'm just giving you an idea. It's something that plugged into the Super NES, got the old one and the new one here, that allowed you to play Game Boy games on television. All the Game Boy games were compatible with it, but some of them had special abilities, or some of them had special things to them, like special borders. Street Fighter 2 had that. You can't really see that because the light's blinding it, but this is Street Fighter 2, the Game Boy edition. Not very great, but it does have the cool borders on it. Let me see, what else? World Heroes Jet. This is kind of a rare game. The emblem for it, I don't know if you can see it, right above my nail. I thought this camera would make it look better, but it actually makes it look worse. But from maybe far off you can see it. There's a Super Game Boy emblem. I don't know why it's not on this, probably because this is, it's got that little seal of Nintendo quality or whatever. It's called the Player's Choice Million Seller. I don't know how it was a million seller on Game Boy, but it was a million seller in general. Maybe that's why they did it that way. But that one was a reissue. All these other games are pretty much first editions. You may have noticed down here in the corner some goofy cases. But before I get into all that, I'm just going to go through each individual game. First game, of course, up here in the corner is Super Street Fighter, or no, not Super Street Fighter 2, just Street Fighter 2. And this is not the World Warrior because it only features a couple of the characters from the game. The back doesn't even show you what all characters are choosable, but this one, see how the color is more vibrant there than it would be on the Game Boy, and it's got the special Super NES border around it to try to trick you. But that's what the Super Game Boy did. It gave you extra stuff. Box instructions included. All these games pretty much have the instructions except for these four down here. All of these games have cases, but only a couple of them have boxes. And like I said, these are goofy boxes down here, but we'll get to that later. Like I said, most of them have good instructions, not tattered, messed up. They were actually pretty well taken care of, except for these four down here and these two goofy ones. They don't have instructions. Okay, down the list. This might have been a reissue too, actually. Sunsoft was reissuing a bunch of games. This, I think, was a game that they actually made, though. Tumble Pop. It was based off an arcade game. It's really fun. Really, really fun. In fact, I went out and bought it when I played it on somebody else's Game Boy. Then down here, this is a Game Boy Color game. You need the special Game Boy Color to play that. You can't play it on the Super Game Boy, and you can't play it on a regular Game Boy. But you can play it on a Game Boy Advance. All these games can be played on most Game Boy Advances. This is Power Quest. I thought this game was going to be huge. Well, not really huge, but I thought it was going to be, pretty popular because it was the first kind of game like that. But at the time, Pokemon was a lot more or a lot more popular or whatever. But I'm wasting too much time on this. But this is also from Sunsoft. Mr. Driller. This game is so much fun. And this is a Game Boy Color game as well. Instructions included. Very nice. These goofy ones, like I was talking about before, this is Game & Watch Gallery 3, which includes, let's see what games it has. Egg, Turtle Bridge, Greenhouse, Mario Bros, and Donkey Kong Jr. They have modern and classic versions of this, and they also have Game Boy Color versions of this, so you can play it with the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. Some Game Boy games didn't allow you to do that. The ones that did were usually these black cases, they have still the Game Boy indent. That means that they could still be played on regular Game Boy, but also enhanced graphics on the Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Colors that could not be played on the regular Game Boy were usually clear, not black, and they had a bulge to the top lip instead of an indent. So, and that would be the case with Donkey Kong Country right here. Nintendo did make, and Rare made Donkey Kong Land, but then they refashioned it as Donkey Kong Country, which is basically they squished the Super NES one down to this. This one had the infrared capabilities. It also had printer capabilities, like if you had the Game Boy camera or printer, you could do some crazy stuff, make some stickers and all that stuff. And it's also had Game Link for co-op, I believe, and maybe a versus thing. Not very many people got into that anyway. Game Boy Color was not very popular. Well, I mean, it was popular, but it was not as popular as the original Game Boy, and it was definitely sandwiched once the Game Boy Advance came out. So there's those, Game Watch Gallery 3 and Donkey Kong Country. The reason why they're in these goofy cases, I put them in basically green DVD cases, was because their cardboard cases, I bought them used, were pretty torn up. I don't know if you can kind of tell, there's some tatteredness to them. So I thought, okay, I'll just transfer all my Game Boy games over to these green cases, because I had a bunch of green cases, because I worked at Blockbuster and I bought some green cases. But the problem is that I didn't have boxes to most of these, so I just gave up on that idea. I was going to do it with these, but the boxes on these were pretty nice since I bought them new, so never mind those. Here's some older Game Boy games, not Color, not Super, just regular old Game Boy games. Let's go through them. Super Mario Land, Super Mario Land 2, Solar Striker. Solar Striker was a launch game. I thought I was going to hate it at first, but it was actually pretty cool. I never did beat it. Balloon Kid was kind of challenging for a kid, and I loved it. I find out many years later that they actually had an international version of it that was a Game Boy Color game, and it looked better, but it was basically the same game, still a great game. RoboCop, if you know who Ocean is, basically they're like the Data East of the home consoles. Data East was a arcade game maker, and yes, this is much like the arcade game, but it's very dumbed down graphics, but it's very challenging, very fun game, I thought, anyway. Mercenary Force, a little bit light on, I guess it was meant to be kind of like a fast action paced RPG type game, but really the RPG element is very lacking. There was a code. The only way I could beat it was with this code, and I think it gave you like a worse ending, like you still lose even when you beat the game. It's kind of goofy. This didn't have much to it, but I was a big WWF, yes, I said WWF, not WWE, fan back in the day. This has got Macho Man on the cover, and Hulk, and of course Ultimate Warrior. But there was only two other playable characters in it. I think it was Mr. Perfect. Well, it doesn't show on the back of here, but it was Mr. Perfect and Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man. Anyway, then, keeping with the theme of licensed product, here's Bart Simpson's Escape from Camp Deadly. I did beat that game. It was very fun. Same thing with Fall of Foot Clan. The graphics on this were actually better on this one than they were on the second Turtles game, Back from the Sewers. But this was an Ultra game, both from Konami, but Ultra was the label that they put on this. I'm kind of running out of time here. Well, not really, but I just don't want to overspeak this. This one might have a little bit more tatteredness to it, because I do remember tracing some of this. I was very into the Turtles back then. But yeah, most of the instructions, very nice. I kept them clean and all in the same place once I broke down the boxes. I wish I'd have kept the boxes. And maybe you, since you're going to be bidding on this, wish I kept the boxes, but unfortunately I didn't. Like the same thing as these two. All the instructions are pretty nice, except for this one, a little bit worn out, but it still works. I think most all of these were color instructions, except for a couple of them maybe, but Now on to the ones without instructions or boxes or cases or anything. I already talked about World Hero Jet. That was a Super Game Boy game. It's basically, you take World Heroes, it's 2 Jet, it's a Takara game. I don't know if you know who Takara is, but they did like things like Fist of the North Star and stuff like that, I believe. Jaleco did this. This is kind of a Japanimation theme too. Battle Unit Zeoth. Turtles 2, Back from the Sewers, the Game Boy game. It's kind of fun. It had a cooler element to it. Instead of dying, you got captured, but you could also, at the end of the level, go back and try to recapture your turtle back, so you had more guys to go on further in the game. And this is a lip-out, non-indented Game Boy Color game, so that means it can only be played on Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance. This doesn't have a label to it. It's clear, and you're like, what the hell is this? This is Dragon Warrior 3, when Enix started making games for Nintendo again after the Wonder Swan went down, and Square and Enix got together and made nice with Nintendo. They did a color version, or a revamped version of Dragon Warrior 3. They also did Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 together. Same thing with, I think it was Final Fantasy 1 and 2 together on Game Boy Advance. That was later on. But before that happened, this happened. I know it doesn't have a label on it, so you're like, that's not Dragon Warrior 3. Well, I'm going to prove it. This is not for sale. I'm sorry, this is my original Snow White Game Boy Advance. It's probably not going to show up very well, but I do want to show you on the screen here that this is, you can't see it very well. See how it says Enix on the bottom there? It is Enix Dragon Warrior 3. Now let me press the button so it'll advance, and you'll see Dragon Warrior 3 Game Boy Color game. You can see myself in the reflection there. But yes, this is Dragon Warrior 3. It is not something else. So unfortunately, the label got ripped off of it. I don't know how. I bought the game used, I think, from Blockbuster again. So it wasn't my fault. But it still works. It's still Game Boy Color game, Dragon Warrior 3. So I'm not lying about that. That's the game that you're going to be getting when you bid on this. And I want to say happy bidding to everybody. Again, the Super Game Boy, my Game Boy Advance, is not for sale. But this collection is. This is basically a classic Game Boy collection with some Super Game Boy and Game Boy Color games mixed in. Thank you so much for watching. Sorry if I rambled too much. Most of them, like I said, came with cases and instructions. And, you know, thank you so much for watching. And happy bidding.